The Harbors of Necessity: How Allied Ingenuity Breached the Atlantic Wall. The date was May 30th, 1942. In a secure, smoke-filled conference room deep within the British War Office in Whitehall, London, a proposition so radical it bordered on heresy was laid before an assembly of the nation's most senior military strategists and engineers. Admiral Louis Mountbatten, standing before maps of the French coast, presented a concept that defied centuries of established military doctrine. He suggested that if the enemy had rendered all existing ports impregnable, then the Allies must fabricate their own harbors, piece by piece, and tow them across the English Channel to the invasion beaches. The reaction was immediate and derisive. The room, filled with men whose entire careers were built upon the immutable principles of naval logistics and structural engineering, erupted in laughter and scornful jeers. The notion was a professional insult. It contradicted everything they understood about hydrodynamics, harbor construction, and the ferocious, unpredictable nature of the Channel's tides and weather. To conceive of building an entire, fully functional port from scratch, disassembling it into a flotilla of components, transporting that armada across one of the world's most treacherous waterways, and then reassembling it under the direct fire of the German Wehrmacht, all within a matter of days, was not merely ambitious. It was, by every conventional metric, pure madness. Yet within that chorus of ridicule lay the embryonic spark of what would ultimately become the single most audacious and triumphant engineering feat of the entire Second World War. This was a project of such staggering scale and innovation that it would fundamentally rewrite the tactical playbook for amphibious warfare and shatter the core strategic assumptions upon which German defensive planning was built. The complex equation for achieving victory on D-Day was being formulated not solely in the realm of battle tactics and troop movements, but in the drafting offices of engineers, in the casting of millions of tons of concrete and steel, in the precise calculations of tidal flows, and in the revolutionary philosophy that what was deemed impossible was merely a complex problem awaiting a sufficiently ingenious and determined solution. The Cauldron of Dieppe, a lesson written in blood. The absolute, gut-wrenching necessity for such a fantastical solution had been seared into the Allied consciousness less than 3 months prior on the brutalized shingle of Dieppe. On August 19, 1942, Operation Jubilee, a large-scale raid primarily involving Canadian forces, was launched to test German coastal defenses and probe the feasibility of seizing a fortified port. The operation swiftly devolved into a catastrophic failure. German machine gunners, ensconced within virtually impervious concrete bunkers carved into the towering white chalk cliffs, unleashed a murderous interlocking field of fire that cut down wave after wave of Allied soldiers as they struggled ashore. 27 Churchill tanks that managed to clatter onto the beach were systematically destroyed or abandoned, becoming burning hulks that littered the shoreline. The human cost was staggering. Of the 4,163 Canadian soldiers who embarked on the operation that morning, a mere 2,210 returned to England, many of them grievously wounded. The final casualty figures were a blow to the Allied command. Canadian losses alone numbered 3,367, which included 916 killed in action and a further 1,746 taken as prisoners of war. The Royal Navy lost 75 sailors, with 269 more missing or captured, while the Royal Air Force sustained 62 aircrew fatalities in the furious dogfights over the town. In stark contrast, German casualties were estimated at barely over 600. The entire desperate engagement, from the first landing to the final chaotic evacuation, lasted less than 9 hours. Those 9 hours imparted the most expensive strategic lesson of the war for the Allies. It proved beyond any doubt that a direct frontal assault on a heavily fortified French port was a recipe for slaughter and certain defeat. In a confidential after-action report, Major General John Hamilton Roberts, the commander of the 2nd Canadian Division, later wrote, The strength of German port defences exceeded all intelligence estimates. Concrete casemates housing heavy artillery proved impervious to naval bombardment. Even had we captured Dieppe intact, German counterattacks would have reclaimed it within 48 hours. This analysis presented the Allies with an inescapable and paralyzing strategic paradox. To successfully invade and sustain a force in Europe, they absolutely required the throughput of a major port. Yet the Germans had so formidably fortified every single port from the northern tip of Norway to the Spanish border that assaulting one was tantamount to military suicide. The German fortress, Rommel's unbreachable wall. This defensive philosophy was not a static one. Recognizing the inevitability of an Allied invasion, Adolf Hitler had appointed one of his most dynamic and aggressive commanders, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, as Inspector General of Atlantic Wall Defenses in late 1943. Rommel, with his characteristic energy and tactical acumen, immediately set about transforming what had been largely a propaganda boast into a genuinely formidable obstacle. After a thorough 2-week inspection tour in December 1943, Rommel filed a confidential assessment that was brutally frank. He found that a basic concept for defense did not exist in any form, and that existing precautions were wholly inadequate for the threat of a major landing. Rommel's solution was to saturate the potential invasion zones with obstacles. He ordered the laying of millions of mines on the beaches and in the fields behind them. He demanded the rapid construction of concrete pillboxes, gun emplacements, and strong points at every conceivable landing site. He personally oversaw the installation of elaborate beach obstacles, jagged steel hedgehogs, wooden stakes tipped with explosives, and metal gates, designed to tear open the hulls of landing craft at high tide. Inland, he planted countless Rommel's asparagus, tall, sharpened poles, in open fields to glider and paratrooper landings. Most critically for the Allied planners, Rommel dedicated immense resources to making the ports themselves into veritable fortresses. In a secret year-end memorandum to Hitler dated December 31, 1943, Rommel asserted, "The focus of the enemy landing operation will probably be directed against 15th Army's sector. It is likely that the enemy's main concern will be to get the quickest possible possession of a port or ports capable of handling large ships." Acting on this assessment, Hitler formally designated 11 major ports as Festung, fortress locations, including Dunkirk, Boulogne, Le Havre, Cherbourg, Brest, and Saint-Nazaire, each to be defended to the last man and the last bullet. These fortress ports received priority for men, artillery, and construction materials, becoming citadels of reinforced concrete, heavy naval guns, and fanatical garrisons. The entire German defensive strategy rested upon a foundational assumption so deeply ingrained in military history that no senior commander in the Wehrmacht ever thought to question it. A large-scale invasion force would be logistically incapable of surviving without capturing a deep-water port within the first few days of landing. This axiom had governed military campaigns since antiquity. Armies needed protected harbors for their supply ships, fixed docks with cranes to unload heavy equipment like tanks and artillery, warehouses for stores, and repair facilities. Without these, any beachhead would inevitably wither on the vine, strangled by its own lack of supplies and vulnerable to being crushed by German panzer counterattacks. The seed of an audacious idea. We shall take a port with us. The Allied High Command, acutely aware of this dilemma, found itself trapped in a seemingly impossible conundrum. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the newly appointed Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, captured this strategic despair in a personal diary entry from March 1943, noting the impossible choice between attacking a fortified port and suffering catastrophic losses, or landing on open beaches and watching the supply lines collapse. The alternative, the one that had seemed so laughable in the Whitehall conference room, had, in fact, been germinating in the minds of British innovators even before the Dieppe disaster. The concept's intellectual lineage could be traced back to Winston Churchill himself. In 1917, while serving as First Lord of the Admiralty during the First World War, Churchill had mused about using flat-bottomed barges and manufactured caissons to create an artificial harbour for planned operations against Dutch islands. Though the war ended before the idea could be tested, it never left Churchill's formidable imagination. In the spring of 1942, during a discussion about the port problem, Churchill, with his characteristic rhetorical flair, electrified the room by declaring, "If we cannot capture a port, we shall construct one and take it with us." This was not merely a whimsical turn of phrase, it was a directive born of sheer strategic necessity. On May 30th, 1942, Churchill formalized this vision in a terse 60-word directive to Admiral Mountbatten. "Piers for use on beaches. They must float up and down with the tide. The anchor problem must be mastered. Let me have the best solution worked out. Don't argue the matter. The difficulties will argue for themselves." Thus, the Mulberry Harbor project was born. Mountbatten assembled a secret team of Britain's most brilliant civil engineers, naval architects, and construction specialists. Their initial meetings at the Institution of Civil Engineers in Westminster were fraught with skepticism and generated more seemingly unanswerable questions than solutions. The sheer physical and logistical scale of what Churchill demanded appeared to violate the fundamental laws of physics and engineering. The planning staff of Cossack, Chief of Staff to the Supreme Allied Commander, under Lieutenant General Frederick Morgan, began to quantify the staggering requirements. These artificial harbours would need the cargo handling capacity of Dover, Britain's busiest cross-channel port. They would have to offload a minimum of 12,000 tons of supplies per day, irrespective of weather conditions. They needed to accommodate everything from small landing craft to massive 10,000-ton Liberty ships. They had to provide safe anchorage in seas up to force 6 on the Beaufort scale. And most dauntingly, they had to be assembled and fully operational within a matter of days following the initial landings. The technical specifications alone filled volumes. Contributions came from a host of brilliant minds. A Welsh civil engineer, Hugh Ioris Hughes, submitted detailed plans for a floating harbour. Royal Engineers Lieutenant Alan Beckett designed revolutionary flexible steel roadways that could ride the massive tidal surges while maintaining a continuous connection to the shore. Naval architects proposed using obsolete merchant ships, codenamed corncobs, to be scuttled in a line to create instant breakwaters, dubbed gooseberries. The most monumental component was the Phoenix, gigantic hollow concrete caissons that could be floated across the channel and then sunk in precise locations to form the primary breakwater walls. From drawing board to reality, the immense construction effort. A pivotal conference, codenamed Rattle, was held at Largs, Scotland, in October 1942, where the complete Mulberry scheme was presented to Allied planners. The presentation lasted 4 hours and delved into every technical minutiae. American officers, in particular, were profoundly skeptical, with one U.S. Navy captain reportedly dismissing the entire plan as the most preposterous scheme I've ever encountered. The British response was one of grim resolve. The plan was preposterous, but the alternative, abandoning the invasion of Europe, was unthinkable. A crude but effective demonstration using a conference room sink, paper boats, and a hairbrush to simulate waves helped to visually prove the principle. Protected water meant surviving ships, which meant sustained supply. The proposal gained formal Allied approval at the Quebec Conference in August 1943. Churchill, with his unparalleled oratory, won over President Franklin D. Roosevelt and the combined chiefs of staff by arguing, "The Germans will not believe such a thing possible. Their disbelief will be our greatest weapon." With approval granted, an industrial effort of almost unimaginable scale commenced across the United Kingdom. The project was plagued initially by bureaucratic infighting between the War Office and the Admiralty over jurisdiction, but this was eventually resolved. From the summer of 1943, work began in earnest, eventually employing up to 45,000 people at dozens of sites. The construction of the Phoenix caissons was a marvel in itself. The largest of these structures were 200 feet long, 60 feet high, and weighed over 6,000 tons. Building 213 of them consumed over 1 million tons of reinforced concrete. Massive dry docks were excavated along the Thames and Medway rivers to construct these colossal concrete boxes, which were designed with flooding chambers so they could be precisely sunk onto the seabed. Dozens of Britain's leading construction firms, from McAlpine to Taylor Woodrow, were contracted to build sections, often in complete secrecy, with workers told they were building components for anti-submarine barriers or post-war housing. The Whale floating roadways were another masterpiece of engineering. Beckett's design used 80-foot-long bridge spans mounted on floating pontoons, beetles, connected by a revolutionary torsionally flexible joint system that allowed the entire structure to flex with the waves while supporting the weight of fully loaded trucks. The spud pierheads were giant floating platforms with legs that could be raised or lowered to sit on the seabed, allowing the platform to rise and fall perfectly with the tide, providing a stable dock for ships. Rigorous testing was conducted at a secret site at Garliston in Scotland, where the geography mimicked the Normandy coast. These trials were vital, revealing critical flaws in early designs. Some flexible roads washed away in storms. Some pontoon anchors failed in sandy bottoms. Through relentless iteration and improvement, the final designs for the Whale, Phoenix, and Bombardon, floating steel breakwaters, were perfected. Security was paramount. The code name Mulberry was chosen precisely because it was meaningless. A major security scare occurred when the words Mulberry, Utah, Omaha, and other invasion code words appeared in the Daily Telegraph crossword puzzle, prompting an MI5 investigation that ultimately concluded it was a bizarre coincidence. D-Day and the Miracle of Assembly. By June 1944, the two complete Mulberry Harbors, A for the American sector at Omaha Beach, and B, Port Winston, for the British Canadian sector at Gold Beach, existed as a vast fleet of components scattered across southern England. The logistics of moving them were mind-boggling. 213 Phoenix caissons, 10 miles of Whale roadways, 33 pierheads, 70 block ships, and 24 bombardons, all to be towed by 150 specialized tugs across the mine-strewn channel. The operation began even as the invasion fleet set sail. While Allied soldiers fought their way ashore on June 6th, the first components of the Mulberries were being towed into position. It was a choreographed ballet of maritime engineering conducted under the threat of enemy fire. By Dieppe Raid, the first Phoenix caissons were being meticulously sunk into place. The old merchant ships of the Gooseberry breakwaters were scuttled in precise lines. Then the long snakes of Whale roadways were connected, stretching from the spud pierheads to the shore. The speed of construction was breathtaking. Within just 1 week, Port Winston at Arromanches was a functioning crescent-shaped harbor, handling cargo ships. Ship captains arriving off the coast were astonished to find a fully equipped port where their charts showed only open beach. The Mulberries were, against all odds, working. The great storm and the triumph of Port Winston. Then, nature intervened with brutal force. On June 19th, the worst channel storm in 40 years raged for 3 days, whipping the invasion coast with force 8 winds and massive waves. The Mulberry A harbor at Omaha Beach, not yet fully secured, was utterly devastated. Phoenix units cracked, Whale roadways were torn asunder, and bombardons broke loose and smashed into the inner harbor. The American harbor was a total loss. But Mulberry B at Arromanches, more protected by geography and more completely assembled, weathered the storm. While damaged, it remained operational. The crucial Gooseberry breakwater of scuttled ships held firm, proving its worth by providing a sheltered anchorage that saved countless vessels from destruction. The storm, while a disaster for Mulberry A, ultimately validated the entire concept. It proved that without even the basic protection of the artificial harbors, the entire invasion fleet might have been scattered and the campaign strangled in its infancy. The Americans adapted brilliantly, developing highly efficient methods for beaching supply ships directly onto the sand at Omaha, but they still benefited from the protection of the Gooseberry breakwater. The British, meanwhile, reinforced Port Winston with components salvaged from the wreck of Mulberry A, pumping the Phoenix caissons full of sand for greater stability. The legacy, a triumph of will and ingenuity. Port Winston, designed for a 3-month lifespan, went on to operate for 10 months. It became a vital artery for the Allied advance, ultimately landing 2.5 million men, 500,000 vehicles, and 4 million tons of supplies. At its peak, it was handling 7,000 tons of material per day. Its success completely confounded German strategy. They had concentrated their best forces around the ports, never imagining the Allies would simply bring their own. Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments, later provided the most telling epitaph for the Atlantic Wall. To construct our defenses in 2 years, we used 17 million cubic meters of concrete and 1.2 million tons of steel. A fortnight after the landings by the enemy, this costly effort was brought to naught by an idea of simple genius. The Mulberry Harbors were more than a tactical innovation. They were a strategic masterstroke that changed the calculus of amphibious warfare forever. They represented the ultimate triumph of Allied ingenuity, industrial might, and flexible problem-solving over German rigidity and conventional thinking. The Germans had fortified what existed. The Allies created what was needed. The project demonstrated that no engineering challenge, no matter how impossible, could withstand the combined forces of necessity, innovation, and unwavering determination. The ghostly remains of the Phoenix caissons, still visible off the Normandy coast today, stand as silent, enduring monuments to the day the impossible was made real, and the course of history was changed by a harbor that sailed to war.